Does your hometown have a local legend that everyone knows about, but tries to avoid bringing up? I bet my story can outdo any wild tale you've ever encountered online. I grew up in a small town with a population of about 1,500. For privacy's sake, I'll keep its name under wraps, so no thrill-seeking adventurers come poking around where they shouldn't. Trust me, it's better this way. The eerie focus of our town's story centers on an abandoned Chuck E. Cheese's, hidden away in the desolate northern part of town. Long ago, my town had a brief moment of prosperity before I was born. But that golden era quickly faded when our main factory, along with most local businesses, relocated. Without the constant flow of customers, places like Chuck E. Cheese's couldn't stay open, and, like much of the town, fell into ruin. Today, it's just a crumbling, haunted-looking building, a perfect setting for rumors and speculation. It all started about 25 years ago, when a boy named Johnny Cameron disappeared. He was only 7. According to local accounts, Johnny and his older brother, Alex, devised a plan to sneak out of the house one night and ride their bikes to the abandoned Chuck E. Cheese's. They pulled it off flawlessly. No one heard them leave, and they made it to the restaurant without a hitch. What happened after that remains a mystery. The following morning, when their parents discovered the boys weren't in their beds, panic set in. A search was launched across town. Alex was eventually found in front of the abandoned Chuck E. Cheese's, curled up and mumbling the same eerie phrase over and over. Where a kid can be a kid. Where a kid can be a kid. That's all he's said about that night since. Some say he was sent to a psychiatric hospital not long after, and rumor has it, he's still there. The police combed through the building top to bottom. The only clue they found was one of Johnny's shoes, half buried in the ball pit. As the years passed with no sign of Johnny, the Cameron family fell apart. Johnny's father, Brady, unable to bear the grief, took his own life 2 years after the disappearance. With her family either gone or institutionalized, Johnny's mother, Susan, spiraled into addiction. People often saw her wandering the same parking lot where Alex was found, muttering to herself. A decade later, the police found her body there. She'd overdosed. Toxicology reports revealed a deadly mix of drugs in her system. That's what people say, at least. With no clear answers, the story of Johnny's disappearance evolved into a chilling urban legend that still circulates today. Folks around here believe there's something malevolent hiding in that Chuck E. Cheese's, something dark enough to destroy anyone who steps inside. They call it the Cameron's Curse. The legend goes that anyone who enters the building will be doomed to a fate worse than death, with their loved ones suffering unimaginable torment for years after. I never put much stock in ghost stories or paranormal stuff, and I definitely wasn't one to believe in those corny, don't call yourself at 3 a.m. YouTube videos. I actually enjoyed debunking urban legends. That's how I ended up in the mess I'm about to tell you about. I was 12 when it happened, hanging out with my best friends Jack and Henry, like we did most summer nights. There wasn't much else to do in our sleepy little town, so we often wandered around aimlessly. Hey, get off your phone and watch where you're going. Jack snapped at Henry, who had just narrowly avoided walking into a lamppost. Who are you texting anyway? I've never seen you so glued to that thing, I teased, as Henry quickly pocketed his phone. Sorry, guys. You know that girl Jessica I told you about? I got her number right before summer break, and I think we're really hitting it off. Henry replied, a grin spreading across his face. Nice, man. Jessica's cute. Have you two made plans to hang out yet? I asked, genuinely happy for him. Henry was usually the quiet one, and it was rare for him to talk to anyone outside of our little trio. Not yet, but I'm thinking of asking her to hang out at Ford Lake next week, he said, excitement creeping into his voice. I really think Henry was cut off mid-sentence as Jack interrupted, his voice sharp. No way you're texting Jessica, man. She's way out of your league. I bet you're messaging your mom instead. Baby need his blankie, Jack taunted, a smug grin plastered across his face. He knew exactly how to get under Henry's skin, and Jack lived for moments like this. Shut up, you asshole! You're just jealous she's not into you, Henry shot back, his voice cracking as tears began to form in his eyes. I could get her number if I wanted to, bro. I just don't Jack's cocky retort was cut short as he noticed me standing still, frozen in my tracks. Cole, come on, man. Hurry up, Jack called out to me. but I didn't respond. Both Henry and Jack quickly abandoned their argument and followed my gaze. Their faces turned pale as they too stared across the street at the eerie, abandoned Chuck E. Cheese's. There was something thick in the air, something that crept up on us without warning. Fear. We stood there, speechless, for what felt like forever, until Henry finally broke the silence. "How did we get this far? We've only been walking for a little while," he stammered. "I don't know, but maybe we should head back," I murmured, still feeling dazed, as if in a trance. Just as we turned to leave, Jack's sudden scream jolted us. "Cops!" Sure enough, a police cruiser was creeping down the road, heading right toward us. "This way!" I shouted, and we all bolted. None of us wanted to deal with the fallout of being caught out past curfew. Without realizing it, we ended up behind the very building that had captured our attention moments earlier. Breathless and bent over, we struggled to catch our breath. "Think they're gone?" Henry gasped, clutching his chest. "I'll check," I wheezed, still trying to get air into my lungs. As I cautiously moved to peek around the corner, blue light suddenly lit up the area, giving us our answer. Then a gravelly voice echoed over a megaphone. "Boys, come out with your hands up. I know you're back there." It was Officer Jenkins, the last cop any of us wanted to see. If he recognized us, our parents would know in no time. "What do we do?" Henry asked, his voice shaking with fear. Jack shot a glance at the rusty employee entrance nearby. "Well, I don't know about you, but I'm not sticking around for 20 lashes and a month of grounding," he whispered, motioning to the door. The old, peeling employees only sign barely clung to the purple door, its letters almost unreadable. "Yeah, I'm with you. Jenkins would definitely make up some story about us stealing or something," I agreed. "But what about the curse?" Henry blurted out, his face growing pale at the very mention of it. Right on cue, Jenkins's voice crackled over the megaphone again. "Don't make me come back there." That was all it took to sway Henry. We scrambled toward the door, almost tripping over each other in our haste. Strangely, the door was already slightly ajar. We barely registered this as we piled inside, Jack quickly locking the door behind us. Once the initial panic wore off and our eyes adjusted to the dim light, we took in our surroundings. "It looks like some kind of break room," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. He was right. Dust coated every surface in the room, which was faintly illuminated by moonlight trickling through a small, grimy window. 2 foldable tables sat to the right, covered in grime, with 4 mismatched chairs pushed haphazardly around them. A vintage tube TV jutted out from the wall, mounted on a precarious-looking plastic arm. On the opposite side, an old refrigerator sat, leaking a brown, foul-smelling liquid onto the floor. Nearby, a rusted, water-stained sink clung to the wall, surrounded by cracked tiles. Against the far wall, a row of battered purple lockers loomed, casting dark shadows that made the room feel even more unsettling. But before we could fully process where we were, Jenkins' muffled voice reached us again from outside, pushing us into action. "We need to hide, just in case he gets in here," I whispered urgently. Jack and Henry quickly nodded, their wide eyes betraying their terror. Henry's hands trembled as we edged toward a door at the other end of the room. The stench of rotting food assaulted our noses as we passed the fridge, forcing us to hurry. I cautiously pushed open the door to the break room, and we stepped out into a massive, dark space. The sheer size of the room sent a shiver down my spine. Squinting through the dim light, I could barely make out the details of the abandoned room. The old ticket booth stood at the front, filled with faded, dusty stuffed animals, waiting eternally for a child who would never come to claim them. Scattered throughout the room were rows of dead arcade games, their screens dark and lifeless, untouched for who knows how long. To our right, 8 metal picnic tables lined the dining area, most covered in empty pizza boxes that had likely been there for years. Beyond the tables, the children's play area loomed in the corner, a tangled maze of brightly colored plastic tubes. At the end of it was a long purple slide leading straight into the ball pit. The thought of Johnny Cameron's shoe being found, buried in those balls, sent a cold shiver down my spine. The feeling that we were being watched grew more intense by the second. I snapped my head to the right, my heart nearly stopping in my chest as I realized what I'd missed on my first scan of the room. There was a stage against the back wall, and standing atop it were 3 terrifying animatronics that looked like they'd been ripped straight out of Five Nights at Freddy's. Their heads were cocked at unnatural angles, their eyes glaring, no, burning, holes into us. The closest one, a chef with a grotesque black mustache, scowled down with an expression of pure hatred. His face was twisted, as if he were filled with rage. "Holy shit," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. Let's go," Jack murmured, his voice trembling. We moved cautiously, weaving our way down the long rows of arcade games. We were almost at the front of the store when Henry suddenly raised a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. "Hide," he whispered, barely audible. In an instant, we scattered, crouching behind the nearest arcade machines. From where I was hiding, I could still see Henry and Jack. Henry's face was pale as a sheet, his finger pointing toward the employee restroom near the ticket booth. The door was slowly creaking open. My heart began to pound harder than ever, and my hands shook uncontrollably. Sweat beaded on my forehead, and I felt lightheaded. Whatever was behind that door was nothing any of us could have prepared for. At first, it was hard to make out in the dim light, but as a sliver of moonlight cut across the room, I saw it. Standing there was a massive, nightmarish rat. The creature was at least 6 feet tall, standing upright on its hind legs. Its yellow eyes were wide and wild, one of them twitching intermittently as though barely held in place. Its huge, crooked orange teeth jutted out from a gaping, dark maw. The thick, matted gray fur covering its body was patchy, with chunks missing altogether, exposing pink, wrinkled skin underneath. A long, disgusting pink tail swayed ominously behind it like a pendulum. But the worst part wasn't the rat itself. It was what it was wearing. A too small purple t-shirt with the faded Chuck E. Cheese logo stretched across its chest. A sickening realization hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just some random creature. This was Chuck E. Cheese. I was yanked out of my shock by a frantic movement out of the corner of my eye. Jack was waving his arms, trying to get our attention. Henry and I both noticed him at the same time. Jack mouthed something, and thankfully, we were close enough to read his lips. "Run on the count of 3. Henry nodded. "Where?" I mouthed back, my eyes darting around for an escape. Jack pointed to the colorful play area in the far corner of the room. I glanced at it, then back at him. In my peripheral vision, I saw Chuck E. tilt his head up, his nose twitching as he sniffed the air. We were running out of time. Jack held up 3 fingers. 1. My heart pounded in my throat. Time felt like it had slowed to a crawl, the adrenaline surging through me. 2. Every second dragged as I braced myself to sprint. I could see the fear etched on Jack's face. He hesitated for just a moment, but it was clear he was just as terrified as I was. 3. We bolted, weaving between the arcade machines, heading for the play area. Behind us, the sound of claws skittering across the carpet told me the rat wasn't far behind. I pushed myself to run faster, and then, out of nowhere, every arcade game in the building flickered to life. The sudden explosion of light nearly blinded me. Every screen buzzed with life, blaring the jingles of old video games from every direction. A speaker overhead crackled to life, repeating an old, distorted commercial jingle on loop. "Chuck E. Cheese's, where a kid can be a kid," it sang. But something was wrong. The voice became more twisted, more distorted with each repetition, as though mocking us. I couldn't let the chaos distract me. We were almost there. We reached the dining area, just steps away from the play area. Then, a blood-curdling scream pierced the air. "Ah!" A gut-wrenching scream rang out just behind me, followed by a sickening thud. It was Jack. I glanced over my shoulder, and what I saw turned my blood to ice. Chuck E. had pounced on him and was tearing into his abdomen, greedily burrowing into his flesh. Jack's face contorted in pure agony. Every muscle tightened as the vermin ripped into him. Blood pooled beneath him, staining the floor. "Keep running," Jack managed to choke out through clenched teeth. His voice was weak, strained but resolute. Blood spilled freely from his mouth, mixing with the dark crimson that coated Chuck E.'s snout. The rat's eyes gleamed with a crazed hunger as it devoured my friend, its disgusting face soaked in Jack's blood. He kicked and thrashed, but it was no use. The creature was relentless. I met Jack's pleading eyes for a moment and whispered, "I'm sorry," as tears streamed down my face. It felt like my heart was being ripped from my chest. Everything in me screamed to turn back, to fight for him, but deep down I knew there was nothing I could do. If I stayed, I'd be next. Henry and I bolted toward the play area, diving headfirst into the maze of plastic tubes. We crawled desperately, with Henry right behind me, winding our way deeper into the tangled system. Jack's agonized cries echoed through the building, each one stabbing into my soul. Guilt racked my chest as his screams grew softer and softer until, finally, they stopped altogether. When we finally came to a stop, I collapsed, overtaken by a wave of uncontrollable sobs. Henry spun me around, grabbing my shoulders as I broke down. "Jack, blood. He's dead," I sputtered, choking on my own words as snot and tears mixed on my face. "Cole, look at me," Henry said, his voice unusually steady. His eyes locked onto mine. "We have to make it out of here before anything else happens. We can mourn later. Right now we have to be brave. That's what Jack would have wanted." His words, as calm as they were, struck a chord. Somehow, in the midst of all this terror, Henry was holding it together. His strength was contagious. Yeah, you're right," I stammered, wiping my tear-soaked face. An ember of determination began to flicker inside me. We had to get out of this nightmare. For Jack. For a moment, we sat quietly, listening to the distant noise of the arcade machines blaring their chaotic jingles. The speaker above was still droning on, but the voice had become something else entirely. A grotesque, distorted growl repeating that same phrase over and over. "Chuck E. Cheese's, where a kid can be a kid." Each repetition felt more twisted, like it was mocking us, but I tried to shove that dread aside, focusing on the escape. "Cole," Henry said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, serious. "I need you to promise me something." "What is it?" I asked, confused. "If I don't make it out of here." He hesitated, looking away. "Tell my mom I love her." "Don't say that," I shot back, grabbing his arm and forcing him to meet my gaze. "We're going to make it out, both of us." "I know, but just in case," he insisted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Promise me." I swallowed hard, seeing the resolve in his eyes. "I promise," I muttered, hating the words as they left my mouth. The weight of the situation was too much. Before either of us could say anything more, a loud clunk echoed from below us, sending chills down my spine. "Shit! It knows we're in here. We have to go now," Henry hissed, panic creeping into his voice. We didn't waste any more time. I darted through the tubes, my heart racing as the sound of scurrying claws reverberated closer and closer behind us. My knees burned and my palms were raw from crawling so fast. My mind raced as I turned down another path. Dead end. I took a sharp left. Another dead end. The relentless clattering grew louder, and I pushed myself forward, driven purely by fear. Then up ahead, I saw it. The exit. Bright light spilled into the tube, and hope surged through me. I crawled with every ounce of strength I had left, the screech of claws against plastic echoing dangerously close. The final tube sloped downward, straight into the ball pit. Without thinking, I launched myself headfirst into the sea of colored balls, Henry right behind me. I waded frantically through the plastic orbs, struggling to reach the edge of the pit. My hands found solid ground, and I heaved myself out, panting. But when I turned to pull Henry out, he wasn't there. "Henry?" I whispered, panic rising in my throat. There was no answer. A rustling sound came from the pit behind me, the balls shifting in an unnatural way. My heart raced as I stared, frozen, waiting for something. Anything to happen. "Hi, Henry?" I whimpered again, my voice barely audible over the pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the balls erupted into the air with a violent burst. Chucky's grotesque form emerged, his matted fur slick with fresh blood. His eyes locked onto me with that same wild hunger, his discolored teeth gnashing together as he lurched forward. The rat's t-shirt, once just tattered, was now soaked in deep red, his frenzied eyes gleaming with animalistic rage. I could feel the depth of his hunger, the primal, savage desire to consume. I was next in line, and I knew this time there was no running. Without warning, Chucky dove back beneath the surface of the ball pit, hurtling toward me like a torpedo, plastic balls scattering in his wake. I seized the moment and tore across the room, my heart pounding as I sprinted toward the exit where we had first entered. Behind me, I heard his footsteps thunder after me, his presence looming, and the piercing glares of the animatronics followed me like a curse. I wasn't religious, but in that moment I prayed to any god who would listen. Just let me make it out. I felt Chucky's rancid breath on the back of my neck, hot and wet, as he rapidly closed in. With one final surge of adrenaline, I crashed through the door, slamming it shut behind me and locking it in a blind panic. Almost immediately, a thunderous crash rattled the doorframe, shaking the entire wall. Another bone-jarring thud followed. I didn't wait to see if the door would hold. I bolted to the employee exit, hurling my entire body weight into it. I tumbled onto the warm asphalt outside, scraping my knees raw, but none of it mattered. A tidal wave of grief, terror, and raw emotion that I had been holding back hit me all at once. I collapsed, wailing uncontrollably, my voice cracking as I screamed out the names of my friends, over and over again, until my throat was raw and my lungs burned. After what felt like an eternity, I finally glanced up, my eyes puffy and swollen. Officer Jenkins was standing over me. One hand rested on his belt, his face somber, yet there was an undeniable look of pity in his eyes. The other two. They didn't. His sentence trailed off, unfinished, but the weight of his words hit me all the same. I shook my head slowly, unable to stop the fresh wave of tears that welled up. Jenkins's face softened further, his mouth tight as he glanced away for a second, something heavy sinking inside him. Then, he looked back at me and extended his hand. I took it, feeling small and weak as he pulled me to my feet. My head hung low as I shuffled toward his cruiser. Before I could reach it, his hand landed on my shoulder, turning me to face him. "Cole," he said quietly, his voice steady but serious. "I'll explain everything to your parents. But if anyone asks, you didn't see anything. You understand?" I nodded, too numb to process much beyond that. True to his word, Jenkins drove me home and did all the talking. After he left, my mom enveloped me in a tight embrace, and I broke down all over again. I sobbed into her arms like a child, knowing that nothing would ever be the same again. Not without Jack. Not without Henry. The weeks that followed were a blur of condolences and sympathetic glances from the townsfolk, but their words were hollow. No amount of "I'm sorry" could bring my friends back. The town held a joint memorial for Henry and Jack, and it was a good service. I remember thinking they did a decent job of honoring their memories, but that didn't ease the ache inside me. I kept my promise to Henry. His mother was there, grieving alongside everyone else, her face etched with loss. After most of the crowd had dispersed, I nervously approached her. She pulled me into a hug before I could say a word. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I know how close you and Henry were." Her eyes were sunken and hollow, devoid of the light I remembered. My throat tightened. "Mrs. Abbott, Henry loved you," I managed to say, my voice trembling as I fought back tears. A flicker of emotion crossed her face, softening the sadness for just a moment. "Thank you," she whispered, before she turned and walked away. The events of that night never left me. They followed me, haunted me, clung to me like a shadow. I left town the day I turned 18 and never looked back. I'm 27 now, married to the love of my life, and we're expecting our first child in a few months. But no matter how far I ran, I could never escape the curse that had been laid on me. In the years since, tragedy has followed me like a storm cloud. My uncle lost his arm in a freak woodchipper accident. My dad died in a car crash a few years ago. My cousin's house burned to the ground, leaving him homeless. I tried to convince myself these were just random, terrible coincidences, but deep down, I knew better. The curse was real. So why am I telling you this now after all these years of silence?